You can be smart, loyal, attractive, and still lose value in front of a man if you're doing the four things most women never realize are silently lowering their worth. And the truth is, it's not about being perfect. It's about protecting your self-respect, your confidence, and your emotional energy. Because the moment you let certain behaviors slide, a man stops seeing your value, not because you don't have any, but because you accidentally hand it away. Today, we're breaking down the four things that slowly kill your value without you even noticing, so you can stop shrinking yourself and start standing in the power you already have. When you start overgiving your energy to someone who barely gives you effort, you don't usually notice it happening in the beginning. It starts small, in tiny ways that feel harmless. You respond a little faster than he does, you check in more often, you put more thought into conversations, plans, and emotional support. You tell yourself you're just being kind, just being understanding, just being patient. But what you're actually doing is teaching him that your energy is unlimited, that your presence is guaranteed, that your attention doesn't have to be earned. And once that dynamic is created, it quietly shifts the balance. You move from being a woman with presence to a woman who is always available. You move from being someone he values to someone he assumes. And that shift is where your value begins to slowly fade in his eyes. Not because you aren't valuable, but because he no longer has to rise to meet you. Overgiving comes from a place of wanting connection, wanting to prove you care, wanting to keep things stable. But when you start pouring from a place of fear, fear of him losing interest, fear of him pulling away, fear of the connection becoming uncertain, you start giving more than you should, more than he deserves, more than he has earned. And every time you do, you tell him without words that his minimum is enough, that he doesn't have to try harder, that you will fill every gap he leaves, that you will meet him more than halfway every time. And this doesn't make him appreciate you. It makes him comfortable. It makes him passive. It makes him take your effort for granted because you've made it too easy. You've made yourself the emotional engine of the relationship while he gets to sit back and enjoy the ride without contributing. When you overgive, you drain yourself without realizing it. You start feeling tired, anxious, unsure, because deep down, you know you're working harder than he is. You start waiting for him to match your energy, but it doesn't happen, and that disappointment builds. You start questioning your worth, thinking maybe if you give a little more, show a little more, care a little more, he will finally reciprocate. But the more you give, the less he feels the need to step up. Your value doesn't decrease because you are less. It decreases because your behavior sends the message that he doesn't need to invest. And men value what they invest in. Men respect what they work for. When you remove the challenge, when you remove the need for him to show up, you remove the opportunity for him to value you. Overgiving also puts you in a position where you lose sight of your own needs. You become so focused on keeping him comfortable that you forget to keep yourself respected. You adjust your schedule, your priorities, your emotional boundaries just to keep him happy. And in doing so, you slowly shrink. You silence your needs to protect his. You bend your standards to avoid conflict. You become the giver while he becomes the receiver, and that one-sided dynamic erodes your value because your self-respect becomes secondary. A woman who respects herself is a woman who holds her value. But a woman who gives until she's empty teaches others to value her the same way she treats herself. To protect your value, you have to recognize when your giving becomes self-sacrifice. You have to see when your effort is not being matched, when your emotional labor is being relied on instead of appreciated, when your consistency is being used as a cushion for his inconsistency. A man notices when you give beyond what he's offering, but he doesn't interpret it as love. He interprets it as permission. Permission to show up less, permission to try less, permission to think that your presence will stay no matter what. The moment you pull back, the moment you stop overextending, the moment you start matching energy instead of exceeding it, you shift the dynamic back to balance where your value is seen again because you are no longer the one holding the entire connection together. When you start ignoring your own standards just to stay easy to be with, you begin a slow process of disconnecting from yourself without even realizing it. It often starts with one small compromise, something you tell yourself isn't a big deal. Maybe he cancels plans last minute and you brush it off even though it bothers you. Maybe he avoids communicating clearly and you convince yourself to stay patient even though it makes you feel uncertain. Maybe he crosses a boundary and instead of addressing it, you let it slide because you don't want to seem difficult. Each time you do this, you're not just giving him leniency, you're teaching him that your standards are flexible. And the moment he learns that your standards can bend for him, your value in his eyes shifts because you've shown him you're willing to settle for less than what you truly want. Ignoring your standards often comes from a desire to maintain peace, connection, and harmony. You don't want to argue, you don't want tension, you don't want him to think you're demanding or dramatic. So you choose silence over expression, tolerance over honesty, accommodation over self-respect. At first, it feels easier. You keep things smooth, you avoid conflict, you maintain the image of being the cool, chill, low-maintenance woman, but the truth is, every time you swallow your discomfort, you're breaking a small promise to yourself. You're telling yourself that his comfort is more important than your boundaries. And every time you do that, your confidence takes a hit, even if you don't feel it right away. The dangerous part is how quickly it becomes a pattern. Once you start lowering your standards for someone, your mind tries to justify it. You start convincing yourself that what you're asking for isn't reasonable or that maybe expecting consistency, effort, clarity, and respect makes you too much. Instead of realizing that your standards are a reflection of your worth, you begin adjusting your worth to match his behavior. And when you operate from a place where you're trying to fit his level instead of honoring your own, you lose the very strength that makes you valuable. Standards aren't rules to control someone, they are boundaries that protect your self-respect. And when you let them go, you lose the protection that keeps your value intact. A man can feel when you abandon your standards. He may not say it, but he notices. He notices the things you let slide. He notices the boundaries you don't reinforce. He notices that you're more afraid of losing him than you are of losing yourself. And that is when the dynamic begins to shift. The moment he sees you're willing to tolerate behavior that doesn't align with what you deserve, he learns that he doesn't need to rise to meet your needs. He learns that the minimum is enough. He learns that your value can be negotiated because you're showing him you're willing to negotiate with yourself. And when he no longer feels the need to step up, he stops seeing you as someone who expects the best from him, and more importantly, from herself. Ignoring your standards also slowly chips away at how you see yourself. You start feeling more insecure, more anxious, more unsure, because deep down, you know you're not honoring the version of yourself you were meant to be. You start feeling like you're walking on emotional eggshells, trying to keep everything together without causing waves. And the more you silence your truth, the louder the internal conflict becomes. You begin to feel disconnected from your strength, from your confidence, from your sense of worth. It's not because you lack value, it's because you've stopped protecting it. And value unprotected becomes value unrecognized. To maintain your value in front of a man, you have to honor your standards consistently, not harshly, not rigidly, but firmly with self-respect. Your standards communicate how you expect to be treated, how you view yourself, and what you believe you deserve. When you hold them, you stand in your worth effortlessly. When you drop them to keep someone, you lose both yourself and the respect you hoped to gain. A man respects a woman whose standards are clear because they tell him she will not settle for anything that diminishes her. And when he realizes he has to meet those standards to keep you, your value rises naturally because you're showing him that you don't lower your worth to make space for anyone. When you start chasing validation instead of holding your presence, you shift from being a woman who is grounded in her worth to a woman who is constantly looking outward for approval. This shift doesn't happen overnight. It begins quietly, almost invisibly. Maybe he pulls back a little, and instead of matching his distance, you try harder. Maybe he becomes inconsistent, and instead of holding your standards, you bend to keep him engaged. Maybe he becomes less expressive, and you overcompensate by becoming more available, more responsive, more attentive. Every time you do this, you're not showing him your value, you're showing him your fear. And the moment a man senses that you're seeking his reassurance to feel secure, the dynamic tilts. He no longer sees you as the woman who stands strong in her identity. He sees someone who is willing to work for his approval, and that silently lowers your value in his eyes. Chasing validation often comes from insecurity, but it doesn't look like insecurity on the surface. It looks like effort. It looks like initiative. It looks like attentiveness. But underneath it is a desire to be chosen, to be affirmed, to be seen as enough. And when your actions are rooted in the fear of losing him, you unintentionally communicate that your emotions depend on his reactions. You start choosing your words based on what you think will please him. You start shaping your behavior to avoid disappointing him. You start giving more than you should to maintain his interest, and slowly you stop being yourself. You become a version of yourself designed to keep him comfortable, and in doing so, you lose the confidence that makes you magnetic. The moment you start chasing his reassurance, you place him in the position of power. You let him determine the tone, the pace, and the direction of the connection. And a man who feels he has too much emotional control often stops valuing what he didn't have to earn. Men respect presence, not pursuit. Presence is calm, steady, self-contained. Pursuit rooted in insecurity is urgent, anxious, and dependent. And even if he doesn't consciously analyze it, he feels the shift. He feels the difference between a woman who holds her ground and a woman who tries to repeatedly prove her worth. One draws him in. The other pushes him away because it makes him feel pressured instead of inspired. When you chase validation, you also start doubting your own intuition. Every small change in his tone, every delayed reply, every subtle distance triggers overthinking. Instead of expressing your needs, you analyze his signals. Instead of communicating directly, you adjust your behavior. Instead of trusting your standards, you look for signs that he still cares. And this puts you in a constant state of emotional imbalance. You begin measuring your value based on how he acts that day. If he gives attention, you feel confident. If he pulls back, you feel uncertain. Your emotional stability becomes dependent on his mood instead of your own sense of self-worth. This is how validation chasing drains your power, because it takes your confidence out of your own hands and places it into his. A man can feel when a woman is anchored in her confidence versus when she is seeking reassurance. A confident woman doesn't need to convince him of her value. She embodies it through her presence. She doesn't chase clarity. She expects it. She doesn't seek attention. She attracts it by simply being aligned with her own standards. But when you chase validation, you lose the quiet strength that makes you irresistible. You lose the mystery, the depth, the emotional self-control that commands respect. Instead of showing him that you value yourself, you show him that you're hoping he will give you permission to feel valuable. To protect your value, you have to stay rooted in who you are even when things feel uncertain. You have to remind yourself that the right man is drawn to presence, not pressure. That your worth is not something you prove, it's something you live. That your energy is most powerful when it is grounded, not anxious. Holding your presence means trusting yourself enough to not overgive, not overexplain, and not overchase reassurance. Because when you stay anchored in your own value, you naturally communicate that his validation is appreciated but not required, And that is what makes a man step forward instead of pull away, because he sees a woman who doesn't need to be chosen to know her worth, and that kind of woman carries a value no man can ignore. When you start accepting inconsistency like it's affection, you slowly train yourself to believe that the bare minimum is enough, even when it leaves you feeling confused, unseen, and emotionally drained. It often begins subtly. A man shows interest one day, then disappears the next. He gives you attention when it's convenient for him, then goes silent when you need stability. He pulls you close when he feels like it, then distances himself when real connection requires effort. And instead of recognizing the red flag, you tell yourself he's busy, he's stressed, he's going through something. You start creating reasons for behavior that doesn't deserve excuses, all because you hope his inconsistency is temporary. But every time you accept it, you send a message that you will stay available even when he is not. And the moment a man realizes you will tolerate unpredictable behavior, he stops prioritizing consistency because he sees it's not required. Accepting inconsistency creates emotional confusion because your heart and logic are constantly battling each other. Your heart holds on to the good moments, replaying the times when he was present, affectionate, or attentive. Your logic sees the gaps, the mixed signals, the repeated patterns. But instead of aligning with your logic, you cling to potential. You become invested in what he could be, not what he consistently shows you. This is where your value starts to fade, not because you lack worth, but because you begin accepting behavior that does not align with the value you deserve. When you start adjusting your expectations downward just to keep someone, you unintentionally communicate that your emotional needs are secondary. The danger of inconsistency is that it becomes emotionally addictive. You start craving the high of his attention because it's unpredictable. When he pulls away, you wait. When he returns, you feel relief, even excitement, as if you've earned something. This push and pull dynamic creates a cycle where you start interpreting his effort as something special instead of seeing it as basic decency. Consistency is not a luxury. It's the minimum requirement for a healthy connection. But when you accept less than that, your emotional baseline shifts. You begin to think affection must be earned instead of expected. You start believing his inconsistency is a test you need to pass instead of a sign you need to walk away from. A man who knows he can come and go without consequence loses motivation to show up fully. He sees that you adjust to his rhythm instead of holding your own. He sees that you stay even when he gives you half effort. He sees that you forgive patterns that he doesn't correct. And once he realizes you will adapt to his inconsistency, he stops valuing your presence because he doesn't have to work to keep it. Consistency requires effort, maturity, and emotional accountability. Inconsistency requires nothing. And when a man can give you nothing and still keep access to you, he doesn't learn to respect you. He learns to use your patience as a safety net. Accepting inconsistency also affects how you see yourself. Over time, you start questioning whether you're asking for too much when all you want is clarity, effort, and reliability. You start internalizing the idea that maybe this unpredictable pattern is the best you can get. You start doubting your expectations, thinking they're too high when in truth, they're healthy. This self-doubt erodes your confidence, leaving you emotionally ungrounded. You begin investing more energy into trying to stabilize him than into protecting your own emotional well-being. And the more you chase stability in someone who is not stable, the more you sacrifice your peace to maintain a connection that isn't supporting you. To maintain your value, you must stop equating inconsistency with interest. When someone truly values you, their actions match their words. Their effort is steady, not sporadic. Their interest is clear, not confusing. Their presence is intentional, not convenient. Consistency is one of the strongest signs of respect, and when you hold that as your standard, you communicate self-worth without saying a word. You show that your time, your heart, and your energy are too valuable to be treated as an option. And when a man realizes you expect consistency, He either rises to meet it or falls away on his own. Either outcome protects your value because you're no longer accepting behavior that diminishes you or convinces you to settle for less than you deserve. When you let the fear of losing him make you lose yourself, you step into a space where your identity begins to shape itself around his presence instead of your own values, desires, and emotional truth. This fear doesn't appear loudly. It starts quietly, like a whisper in the back of your mind telling you to be careful, to not upset him, to not say too much, to not act too strong, to not hold boundaries too firmly. You begin editing yourself in small ways. Maybe you hold back an opinion to avoid conflict. Maybe you hide your disappointment to seem easygoing. Maybe you pretend certain behaviors don't hurt you because you're afraid addressing them might push him away. These tiny moments of self-abandonment add up, and slowly, without noticing, you become a version of yourself that feels safer to him, but less true to you. Fear of losing someone makes you act from a place of emotional survival instead of emotional strength. You begin seeing the connection as something fragile, something that could break if you're too honest, too outspoken, too demanding on your own behalf. So you shrink, you dim, you soften in ways that feel unnatural, and while you think this will make him stay, what actually happens is the opposite. The more you abandon yourself, the less magnetic you become. Confidence fades, authenticity fades, the natural ease you once had fades. You replace your presence with performance, hoping it will be enough to keep him interested. But a man doesn't value a watered-down version of you. He values the woman who stands in who she is without fear of losing anyone who can't handle her truth. When you operate from fear, you start making decisions based on what you think he wants instead of what you truly feel. You say yes when you want to say no. You tolerate behavior that doesn't align with your worth. You silence your needs until they turn into resentment. You bend your personality to match his moods. You sacrifice your peace to maintain his comfort. And each time you do this, you lose a little more of yourself. Not because he takes it from you, but because you hand it over in hopes it will secure something you were never meant to beg for. This is how fear erodes value, not by stealing it, but by convincing you to give it away in exchange for stability that doesn't even exist. A man can sense when you're afraid of losing him. He may not say it out loud, but he feels it in the way you hesitate to confront disrespect. He sees it in the way you over-explain yourself. He notices it when you settle for crumbs and call it connection. He feels it when you chase clarity he never provides. And the moment he realizes you're more afraid of losing him than he is of losing you, something shifts inside him. He stops trying as hard. He stops valuing what he knows won't walk away. He stops respecting boundaries you don't enforce. Fear makes you hold on tighter, but it makes him loosen his grip. Not because he's cruel, but because human nature values what stands firm, not what clings. Losing yourself also affects how you show up in your own life. You stop prioritizing your goals, your friendships, your passions. You become so emotionally invested in maintaining the connection that you forget what made you a full, vibrant, multifaceted woman before he entered your world. You start centering everything around him, and in doing so, you disconnect from the parts of you that once made you powerful. A woman who is connected to her purpose, her boundaries, her growth, and her identity radiates a natural strength. A woman who abandons those things becomes emotionally dependent, and dependency lowers value because it signals that you no longer see yourself as whole without him. To protect your value, you must learn to choose yourself even when you fear losing someone. You must trust that your authenticity is worth more than forced harmony. You must believe that anyone who is right for you will not require you to shrink to fit their comfort. Fear tells you that letting go will make you lonely. Strength tells you that losing yourself is the only true loss. When you stand firm in who you are, even during uncertainty, you send a clear message that your self-respect is non-negotiable. And that message is what commands respect, deepens attraction, and reveals the truth about who is meant to stay. Because the moment you stop fearing loss is the moment you stop losing yourself. And that is where your value rises back to the surface where it always belonged.